All right, hey everybody. So back today with another game that I played, longer game against the Chess Free app. Again, I've talked about this app before. You can find it on any sort of place you get apps. I use the app, as I've said before, to play longer games. So I set it to where it has a 60-minute time setting with a 10-second increments. And it's just a way for me to get longer games, since longer games are generally harder to find uh, online. Playing against people online for longer games is relatively hard to do. So we're gonna go through this game. Again, it's set on the level 10 setting, which they say is about a 1915. Again, don't know exactly how accurate that is, but I feel like I get pretty solid games. Probably actually tougher than most of the opponents that I'm randomly paired with on chess.com in the rapid pool. So yeah, for what it's worth. All right, so started out, played d4 again. I'm focusing on the London a lot recently, so that's what we went into. Black goes with knight f6, bishop f4, e6, e3, d5. These are all the standard sort of London setup. Knight f3, c5. I played knight bd2. People play c3 here as well. Knight c6. I come with c3 now. Bishop d6. I played the most common move here, bishop g3. You can take on d6, but usually people play on bishop g3 with the idea that black can take on g3 and white can take back with their h pawn, developing their rook, their h rook in the process. Black castles, bishop d3, and everything so far has been pretty normal. And then black threw in this kind of weird move, not bad at all, but it's definitely not the most common in this position. So the most common here is b6, by a pretty significant margin. Usually people play b6, trying to fianchetto their light squared bishop. Queen e7 is also a move, probably trying to support the e5 advance in a lot of variations, and the same with this move rook e8. But yeah, black went ahead with queen c7. Again, not losing, not horrible or anything. Maybe slightly inferior to some of the other options I mentioned. Here, I had maybe my first inaccuracy of the game. So I didn't notice. I was playing probably too quickly here. I didn't notice that it with what turned out to be the best move. Whoops, that was the move I played. With what turned out to be the best move, d takes c5. This move is taking advantage of the pin on the bishop. So black can't recapture because bishop takes c7. So in this line, it would go something like bishop takes g3, h takes g3. Maybe black continues with h6. We push in the middle with e4, rook d8. And in this position, black has some compensation for the pawn, but white is up a pawn. So this was my first sort of real inaccuracy of the game. It's not terribly awful or anything, but yeah, I wish I would have noticed this. But yeah, like I said, I played castles instead of taking on c5. Black then took on g3. I recaptured, and black went ahead and closed the position with c4. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this kind of move for black. It's not a bad move by any case. Computer says it's definitely fine. I think computer might give this as something like the third or fourth best move. And there's marginal differences between it and the supposed best moves. But from a playability perspective, if I have the black pieces, I'm probably shying away from this, because the pawn on c5 just keeps a lot of tension with white, and it makes it harder for white to do what they want, which is to push e4. But after black plays c4, as we'll see in a couple of moves, I play pretty easily the break e4 and get on with my play, as I want to do with my sorts of plans. So instead here, a move like e5 or possibly rook d8, sort of lining up against white's queen in anticipation of the d file opening after some trades, are possibly more playable directions in which to go. But again, a small point as far as move choice. What I wanted to point out more so is from a playability perspective, if this is the kind of thing that black wants to go in for, especially for a human player. So yeah, black went for c4. I have to retreat my bishop, so I go bishop c2. And then black plays, maybe after, well, this is their first real inaccuracy, I would say. It's not a mistake, it's not a blunder or anything, but it's just kind of a lazy move. And after this move, so if we sort of go into possible alternatives from this position, computer saying things like e5. E5 probably the best, breaking in the center. The computer also mentions b5 and rook b8. Rook b8 trying to support queenside play with the b pawn push, even though black could just go straight forward with b5 anyway. But computer says e5, just trying to get some counterplay in the center. It's the way to go. Black's move choice, bishop d7. Again, like I said, kind of lazy. And after this, over the next 10 moves or so, I built up a pretty decent, strong advantage, which made for a pretty comfortable game, at least for this next part of the game. So I did my break e4 in the middle. Black captures. We trade knights. The bishop takes, and black retreats knight e7. I jump in with knight e5, given that black has just taken away their defense of the e5 square with the knight. Black tries to kick me. I take their bishop, looking for a possible bishop versus knight situation with hopefully pawns on both sides of the boards and both sides of the board, and hoping for a possible advantage in that situation, especially going to an endgame type of scenario. Black recaptures, and then I play queen h5 with the idea of hopefully eliciting some kind of further weakening of black's kingside pawn structure. And in fact, that's what we get. So we got a5, the bishop retreats, queen d5. Black lines their queen up with my queen and centralizes it, getting it more active. Rook fe1, knight g6, rook e3, looking to possibly double on the e-file, get my other rook into the game. And here was black's first real big mistake. So when I played this move, rook e3, of course I'm trying to think, how can black respond? And one of the main moves I looked at was actually the move that black played, which was this move f4. I was wanting to make sure that I had something against f4, since f4 forces action on my part, right? It both connects with my g-pawn, but more importantly, in so doing, it hits my rook as well, making it that I have to react. In my analysis of rook e3, when I was trying to decide if I could play rook e3, I pretty much had determined that I could play rook e3 and didn't have to worry about f4, because I could just trade queens, even though my queen is attacked in this position and my rook is attacked. I could just trade queens and just advance my rook, or just take on f4, and I could get out of possible hairy tactical issues. So I'd sort of seen that before I played rook e3, and when this move f4 landed on the board, what happened is, and I think this is a mistake that I make and probably a lot of people make, I didn't rethink my move. I didn't consider it again in light of the position as it actually stood on the board, and and I just went ahead and played queen takes d5, which turns out to be an error, and one of my biggest errors of the game. Definitely the biggest error to this point. It's not like I'm losing or anything, but I had a big advantage at this point, a winning advantage, had I simply noticed that in this position, the g6 knight is pinned. So I can play rook to d5. The g6 knight is pinned because if the g6 knight hops in and takes the rook, this is a blunder on its face. It's a blunder to mate in 3. So white has bishop takes h7, king h8, bishop g6 check, king g8, and queen h7 mate. So yeah, if I had noticed that the g6 knight was pinned, I could have played rook e5, and then we would have gotten something like this kind of line. White advancing their pawn, g4, rook f7, g5, rook a to f8, rook a to e1, putting pressure, rook e7, trading off the minor pieces and taking a pawn, queen e8, trading off the queens, g6. And in this position, white has an extra pawn. They've tied up black's pieces, black's rooks, to passive defense of the e-pawn, and they've put a nice clamp on black's king. Black's king is going to have a hard time trying to get any activity, and in this position, white is just totally winning. So had I noticed this pin on the g6 knight, I could have gotten some type of position like that, which would have been much better than what I got in the game. It's not like I'm losing at this point or whatever, but basically I had a winning situation that I sort of let slip away. So queen takes d5, e takes d5, and now I get rid of black's annoying f-pawn. Black recaptures, and then I double on the e-file. Black plays a6, trying to get some queenside pawn play going. I come in, rook e7, and importantly in this position, one needs to notice that if black tries to play something like rook f7 to challenge my rook on the 7th rank, I've got this move bishop takes h7 check. At minimum, winning a pawn. If black recaptures, then I get an exchange as well. So yeah, that's just a tactical point. A nice sort of thing for white to be aware of, that black can't play like that. So black went ahead instead and played b5. And at this point, I made maybe my second biggest error up till this point. Trying to figure out ways to get active in this position. And we've all heard the idea that if we put two of our rooks on the 7th rank, that can be really bad for the opponent. And that's what I tried to do. So I played rook to d7, and knowing full well that black has ways to stop this, but I was looking around at other possible move choices. Nothing seemed terribly compelling, and I was like, hey, I got to do something, and this felt sufficiently active. As it turns out, not really a great move at all. I should have went in for something like, instead of rook to d7, something like rook 1 to e3, trying to gain some activity with my second rook. As it turns out, we'll see that this is going to make room for my king to get out of. In this position, if I try to play something like g3, black has this move, knight h3 check, forking both my king and pawn, and with the second rook, or second piece, the rook attacking the pawn, black's going to win a pawn. So trying to sort of free things up, allowing my king to move, possibly coming to the e-file. This was the better kind of way to go. So a line here might have been something like g6, again getting my king out of possible checks from the knight, rook a to b8, a3, trying to stop Black's advances on the queen side. Rook to b6, g3, evicting the knight. Knight h5, now trying to get some king activity. Rook to f7, not trading that rook, but trading this rook. Rook to f6, still not trading rooks. Rook to b6, king to f3, and black plays a5. And in this position, white has a really nice advantage stemming from their, awesome active rook. They've got a bishop versus white's awkwardly placed knight. And black's king has, minimal prospects, especially at this point. Very, very preferable position from white there, especially as to what happened in the game. So instead of that, I played, instead of this move rook 1 to e3, I played rook to d7. And black, of course, goes ahead and stops me from doubling. I force them to take on e7 so that I can retain control of the e file. They played rook f8. And then I try to get some activity for my king. f3, a5. Black continues their advance. And at this point, we're sort of petering out to a drawish looking position. So king f2. b4, g3, evicting the knight, knight d3 check. And in this position, I've got to, I can't let this knight stay here. So the only real move is bishop takes. C takes, and it looks like in this position that, white should be doing great. Black's got these doubled pawns. White should be very easily be able to come over and round up the d3 pawn. But as I've said about the computer, in this case the level 10 of the Chess Free app shows resiliency. So these like superficial factors that I just laid out, it figures out ways to make it incredibly tough. And as it turns out, this is not at all winning for white, even though it might look like it on its face. So best move turns out to be rook e3 as opposed to coming up with the king. So if you play something like king to e3 in this position, white just has d2, forcing you. King takes d2 when black can play rook takes f3, then attacking your g3 pawn, and that's no good. So we want to come back with our rook, and here's where I was talking about, the computer can just really sort of show that there is counterplay resources in a position that looks like it should be lopsided. So computer plays this move rook to b8, and the point is, it eventually in some lines wants to come into b2, fork my king and the a pawn, and that's basically the keys to success, and we'll sort of see how that plays out to come. Best move here, rook takes d3 is what I played. B takes c3, b takes c3, and then we do get this fork rook b2 check. King e3, not being consigned to the first rank, but coming up. Rook takes a2. And then in this position, I misevaluated and committed probably my biggest error, I would say, of the game. And this is an error that, if you've looked at anything about endgames, you've probably come across, which is the idea that if you're going to trade into a king and pawn endgame, you've got to be certain that it's winning. And yeah, I thought I saw that this was winning, but I did not accurately calculate it. So my thinking was, I played rook d2. My thinking was, if they trade on d2, then I've got 1, 2, 3 squares to go to, and if we say, hey, black's got the move, after my king is on d2, black's got the move, they move their king 3 squares, 1, 2, 3, And then, in that same time, that means that black is going to do something like land on d6, after which I'm going to land on a4 with my king. They're going to land on c6 with their king, and I can take their a pawn after that. I'll have 4 pawns to 3. They shouldn't be able to get at my c pawn, and I should just have a more active king in their position, and I should just win. This line of reasoning seemed compelling to me in the game, and so that's why I went with it. But it turns out that there was a refutation not bound up with that line of reasoning that just refuted my position. But thankfully, black did not play that refutation. So they played rook a1 instead. So what should they have done instead of playing rook a1? In this position, they needed to take. I take back, and then they play something like king f7. Let's say that I try for this plan. Coming over, they play king e6, or even, they can bring their king up. They can play h5. Let's go with h5, trying to get counterplay over here. Let's say I try to bring my king over again. Here they play g5. Again, I try to go after their pawn. h4. They've got this outside pass pawn. I just did not figure this into my calculations at all. I just simplistically looked at, can the king come over and defend? I wasn't thinking at all about the counterplay that they could have gotten with a pass pawn on the opposite side of the board. So a great testament to sort of needing to fully evaluate a position, especially all the intricacies of a position. When you trade into a king and pawn endgame, you've got to know if in fact it's winning or not, because once you go into a king and pawn endgame, that's it. It's either winning or it's not. But thankfully for me, they played rook a1, which basically brought the game back into drawing territory. I played rook b2. They advanced their a pawn, and then I played rook b7. Turns out here, I didn't need to do this yet. So my thinking was to cut the king. So in playing rook b7, I was thinking of cutting the king off to the 8th rank, and then I'd get behind the pawn. But here I needed to play king f4, because for one, I've got more than enough time with the pawn on a5 to make the 2 moves necessary to get behind it. It's not terribly important to cut the king off to the 8th rank at this point in the game, but it is terribly important for the king to be able to get out of possible annoying checks from the rook, and this move king f4 needed to be played at this point. But again, I played rook b7, and thankfully for me, this was black's probably their last chance to win the game. They didn't take that opportunity and instead played the most obvious move, which was advancing their pawn more. What they needed to do in this position, instead of playing a3, was to play g5. And the point about this is that it restricts my king. I can't go to the 4th rank now. I can't gain shelter against possible checks from the rook, and it becomes a much more, let's not do that. It becomes a much more annoying position to play. So if they had played correctly, we might have gotten a line like this. So they played g5, I get behind their pawn, a3, king f2, trying to get to the so-called safe squares in this position, g2 and h2. King f8, king h2, h6, king g2, h5, rook a8 check. King f7, rook a7, king e6. So we get this line that sort of goes on like this. And this is the point that I wanted to sort of bring it to. White is not black is not immediately winning in this position, but black is definitely the one pressing for the win. Black's got the far advanced passed pawn. Black's got the advanced pawns on the king side. If anybody's going to win this game, it's going to be black. And again, it all started with this move in this variation, g5, restricting, g5, restricting the movement of my king, restricting the advance of my pieces on the king side. But yeah, again, luckily black didn't play this. They played, I think, the move most humans would have played as well, a3, just getting their pawn going. And yeah, after this, it sort of becomes very drawish once again. So just going to go through a few moves here. I get my king out of checking distance. They play rook c1. I play rook a7. They take the pawn. I try to get my kingside pawns going. I'm now down a pawn, so things aren't looking terribly great. And I'm about to be down another pawn, but I'm going for counterplay. I don't want to get sort of stuck defending my f-pawn. I go for counterplay. They take the f-pawn. I take the d-pawn. Rook g3. Now they're going to take another pawn of mine. King to e6. Again, counterplay is my only opportunity at this point. They're about to win another one of my pawns. I'm going to be down 2 pawns. My only hope is to get my d-pawn rolling. They go ahead and take. At this point, I felt it would be beneficial to get their king out of the picture a bit. So I played rook a8 check, got their king to the h-file, and then started pushing my d-pawn. Rook e4 check, king d7, rook e3, d6, h5, king c7, rook c3, check, king d8, g5, d7, g4, king e7, threatening to queen my pawn. And now black had 2 opportunities here to save a draw. So they could have played rook c7, or they could have played rook d3. If we look at this line, rook c7, we'd get something like king d6, attacking the rook. Black trades and says, hey, my advanced pawns are going to be giving me enough counterplay to hold the draw here. And so white is going to take the a pawn on their next move, but these advanced kingside pawns, white will be able to take one of them, and black will probably be able to set up a advanced pawn and king versus rook and king situation, which is known to be theoretically drawn. So something like that will probably happen in this kind of line. And if they had played, instead of rook c7 in this position, they had played rook d3, we get a similar sort of outcome. So here, cool tactical point. White can take on a3 because black can't take back on a3, otherwise white queens. So black takes white's pawn, king takes d7, and then h4 by black. Same sort of situation. It's these 2 pawns against the rook, and black's probably going to end up in some advanced pawn and king versus rook situation that is just theoretically drawn. So king e7 is what I played. Black had this option again, rook c7 or rook d3, but instead I think they played a move that a lot of humans would play. So they played rook e3 check, trying to harass my king. I guess hope I go back to d3 or something, but I played the only winning move. So in this situation, I know that black is going to have to trade off their rook for the d-pawn, and so what I do is I just go ahead and rush my king towards black's main source of counterplay here, which is their connected passed pawns on the king side. So rook d3, queening, forcing the win of the rook, g3, king g5, and this move was nice. Several moves are good here, but I especially like this move, king g5, because it just cuts the king off from the defense of the h-pawn. G2, and here was maybe the last really important move that white had to find in this situation, and that was the move rook d1. Just seeing that white defends every possible queening attempt that black can have here, killing any source of counterplay that black has. Black can bring their second pawn down, which is what they did, but it doesn't matter. King takes to h5, king g7, king g4, king g6, king g3. And in this position, the computer resigned. I'm going to take their g-pawn next. I'm going to go round up the a-pawn, and then it's just a simple king and rook versus king ending, which obviously 10, 15 moves, white is going to win. So yeah, interesting game. I think a good example of I had, positional pressure up until this move. Let's see, f4 by black, and then I had a case of just being in my previous moves analysis and led to a mistake, a missed win situation. I think that's kind of a thing that people run into and really sort of exemplifies the need to reevaluate a position when it shows up on the board, not just go with the intuition that you had about the move when you were thinking about it in a previous moves analysis. And then the other big, I think really big learning experience or learning moment in this game, illustrative moment in this game, was knowing for sure whether a king and pawn ending is winning or not before you go into it. It's just a great example of it. I thought I had calculated that it was winning, but my analysis was way too superficial, and as we saw, did not take into account the h-pawn that black could, outside past the h-pawn that black could create in the sort of scenario I was talking about, where I was talking about just racing my king over to take black's a-pawn. So yeah, some interesting learning moments, I think, in that game. I hope you guys got something out of it. If you have any interesting points or anything you want to add in the comments, I'd definitely love to sort of hear your thoughts, and looking forward to getting back to it probably tomorrow with some more content. Yeah, we'll talk to you guys later. Thanks.